We can't successfully drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. unless we know what caused this problem. Why does the swamp exist? Well, it's kind of like diagnosing a medical problem. Sure, you can take Motrin for a headache, but how do you actually cure the headache if you haven't diagnosed the source of the problem? Caffeine withdrawal, perhaps, or sinus infection, or a migraine, or, God forbid, a brain tumor. You have to know where the problem came from before you can eradicate it. That's like the Washington, D.C. swamp. Where did the swamp come from? Let's journey back. The real name for the swamp, or the deep state, is the administrative state. The administrative state is composed of government employees and officials in agencies in the executive branch of our federal government who are not elected, not appointed, have no accountability to voters, are nearly impossible to fire, and yet have the power to impose rules and regulations on us, we the people. These swamp creatures can stay in their positions of power even when administrations transition or politicians are voted out of office. And these swamp creatures wield incredible power. They've also been known to abuse that power. Here's the thing. The administrative state is obviously not part of the United States Constitution. So where did it come from? Isn't the administrative state a violation of the separation of powers among the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches in our federal government? Well, the answer to that is obviously yes. Yet, this hasn't stopped the legislative branch from giving away their legislative power to the executive branch agencies. And sadly, it also hasn't stopped the Supreme Court from deferring to those agencies. Here's what I mean. We have this idea currently in our judicial branch that the courts should defer to the so-called expertise of the individual agencies for rulemaking, as long as the legislative branch has delegated their powers to the agencies. Now, this clearly violates the idea of separation of powers as created by our founding fathers, and yet, the Supreme Court let it happen anyway. By the way, you can read John Locke's theory on government, on which our founding principles were based, to understand the separation of powers was critical to preventing the government from arbitrarily ruling over the people with no accountability and violating their rights in the process. This was the intention of our founding fathers, to separate powers and therefore protect people's individual rights. So when did we get so off track? Who did this? Well, the short answer is progressives did this. Progressives who attacked our constitutionally enshrined view of limited government, starting with Woodrow Wilson. Essentially, the progressives behind the creation of the administrative state, which we know today as the swamp or the deep state, wanted an autocracy. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president of the United States. He served from the year 1913 to 1921. Wilson just didn't agree with the founders that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of the people. He thought government should do what the times demand. Wilson also naively envisioned this neutral administrative class who would operate the government administratively in good faith without being influenced by politics. I know, LOL, right? Amazing that just over 100 years since the US literally fought a war against bad faith tyrannical politicians, an American president could be so naive, so stupid, as to think that mankind no longer has a lust for power and we could staff an unaccountable, bureaucratic federal government with neutral employees who would make rules only in good faith without letting politics tinge them. Ridiculous. Wilson also argued that it was time for the Constitution to evolve to a living Constitution, which stands to reason because Wilson was inspired by a college professor named Frank Goodenough, who openly argued that the Founding Fathers' theory that government's purpose was to protect the natural rights of the citizens was, quote, worse than useless, because such a theory, quote, retards development. Now, for many years in our nation, these radical progressive ideas were stopped by the non-delegation theory, which, as the name suggests, did not allow the legislature to give away their power to unaccountable executive agencies. But following Woodrow Wilson's presidency and his radical progressive ideas permeating the political class and prepping the foundation for the future administrative state, the deep state, the swamp, after the year 1935, the Supreme Court stopped applying the non-delegation theory altogether. And what did we get? We got FDR's New Deal, which actually created the new bureaucracy in the executive branch that Woodrow Wilson envisioned. A new executive bureaucracy that didn't just include executive powers, but also included legislative and judicial powers, a critical violation of the separation of powers in our federal government. Then, we got LBJ's Great Society, which further damaged the separation of powers and instead empowered swamp creatures to rule behind the backs of our elected officials. And by the way, Woodrow Wilson's idea of a class of politically neutral administrative state civil servants, how did that end up working out? Well, according to FEC records, as reported by The Hill, 95% of political donations during the 2016 election from federal government employees went to Hillary Clinton. 95%. So much for politically neutral, unencumbered by partisan political agendas. So as you can see, what used to be a relatively straightforward federal government structure, the legislative branch made the laws, the executive branch enforced the laws, and the judicial branch ensured that the laws didn't violate the Constitution, this was turned on its head. And now, it's not just a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 or even a dozen corrupt deep state operatives violating our rights. It's a structural problem at the highest levels of our federal government, a fundamental violation of the separation of powers as dictated by our Constitution. So you can also see then why simply firing individual swamp creatures is a lot like playing whack-a-mole. If you fire one, another one is just going to pop up in the same place unless we fix the fundamental problem. And one president cannot fix this problem alone. This requires the legislative branch to stop delegating their power to the executive agencies, and the judiciary to reject the administrative state on a constitutional basis. The problem is, Congress members, including many Republicans, not just Democrats, don't want to drain the swamp. The swamp makes Congress's job easy. With the deep state in place making the rules, Congress doesn't have to legislate anything. They don't have to think about the details. They don't have to take positions that might be unpopular. They don't even have to consider whether their plans will work. They don't have to do anything that might threaten their chances at re-election. No. Congress has it easy with the swamp structure in place. They just pass vague laws that defer all the details to the executive agencies who make the rules, and then if anything goes south, Congress can point their finger at the executive branch. But make no mistake, unless we force our elected officials to reject the administrative state and take responsibility for their own legislative jobs, unless our elected officials then reject judicial nominees who would allow the violation of separation of powers, we will never truly drain the swamp.